Hi there, it's Polly here with Winter Mode Mr. Snoots. So I was listening to a German radio station this morning, as is my wont, and they were playing the work of Wendy Carlos, who is a transgender woman that, I suddenly realised I ain't spoken to you about Wendy Carlos. Let's celebrate one hell of a life. Wendy is still with us. She was born in 1939. Still alive, and has been formative in the creation of electronic music, not just as a genre by being a composer, but also as an engineer. She has guided the creation not only of outright electronic music and instruments, but also the mastering process, the sound engineering processes and so forth that have made electronic music a thing, and in fact has been closely involved in inventing and using many of the early processes and perfecting many of the early processes that have made music recording better, like Dolby systems and all these sorts of things. Wendy was born in Pawtucket in 1939, working class family, and was immediately very, very interested in music. It was a working class family, so they couldn't afford much, so Wendy did get to go to piano lessons, but the family couldn't afford a piano, so her dad just drew out a piano keyboard in paper and attached it to a table so she could practice notes. Now, of course, Wendy was born assigned male at birth and came into her ability to express her actual gender later in life. But, like so many of us, always just felt wrong and out of place. Now, Wendy, and if you will pardon the dead naming, born assigned name was Walter, went to university, studied musical composition and physics. And apparently in 1964 at a symposium, found a very nice guy literally snoozing in a chair, and that was Robert Moog, the invention of the Moog synthesizer. If you've ever heard songs like, Popcorn and so on, those are early Moog electronic compositional pieces. But he was looking at making an honest-to-God electronic musical instrument, inspired, obviously by the success of theremins and so on. Now, Wendy had been very inspired in early life by some of the very great electronic music pioneering work that was being done. There was Pierre Henry, who had been through the late 40s doing electronic music, had done a lot of little film scores and so on. Oh, what was my other one favourite? Bebe Barron, female electronic composer. She did the soundscapes and music track for my favourite science fiction film of all time, Forbidden Planet. This was also very inspirational to Wendy Carlos. The ability of these instruments to make haunting and emotional soundscapes was only really just being explored. Now, Wendy worked very closely with Moog as he perfected his Moog musical instrument. It was Wendy that immediately sat down to talk to him about how this thing was actually going to be used and what it had to do. At the end of their first get-together at that symposium where she woke him up, she had convinced him of including essentially slide controls to be able to control pitch and tone and vibrato and so on. As they worked together, she insisted that it have a keyboard which would allow keying into the machine, and a lot of the sound outputs and so on were governed by Wendy. Now, so while working with Moog in 1965, Wendy began working with Leonard Bernstein doing presentations at Philharmonic Hall in Manhattan. So Wendy was getting very well placed within kind of the upper tiers of music and musical presentation and experimentation. She got a position as a sound engineer with a label called Gotham Records, and this gave her enormous experience with mixing machines, with album production, and she later said that this was very important technical skills that she learned a lot. She also laughed to say that people often thought that she was quite arrogant, mostly because she would open her mouth and say things that other people probably would not. I can see that. Yeah. Only tell people the truth, even if that annoys them. So, worked in partnership with Moog, helping him develop his machine, largely often taking payment from him in electronic equipment for her growing home studio. Remember, a lot of this stuff is hand engineered. She had to do things like engineer an 8-track tape machine for her little studio. She had to make it herself from bits and pieces and parts because she couldn't afford to actually buy the sodding tape recorder. She ended up at Gotham Records striking up a friendship with, was it Rachel Elkind? Rachel Elkind. Rachel Elkind was another producer there. Apparently, initially the relationship was a little bit confrontational, as they both had very different ideas on how to work things, but they ended up becoming very, very fast friends, and this friendship lasted up till, I think, 1980, and Rachel became silent partner in most of Wendy's work, and Wendy has said that Rachel is massively credited for the inspiration and the sheer hard work that she did to help get these things done. Often it was her doing a lot of editing work and so on in the background that made Wendy's albums come to life. They, between them, discussed doing an album of electronic music, and the thought struck them that they should do classical music to try and sort of ease the world into seeing an electronic instrument as being a worthy thing to listen to. So they came up with the idea of doing an album of classical Bach pieces. Now, they wanted to pitch this to a record company, but their experience in the industry led them to believe that two women would not be able to pitch a record and get it sold. They enlisted the help of a male producer that they knew to help pitch this, and they got this record idea sold. The album was seen by the company as probably not going to be a big seller, pretty damn niche electronic music, like classical music, So they kind of contemptuously didn't give them much money to produce an album. At that stage, an average album cost about $10,000 to produce. I think at the same sort of general period, the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's album cost like $60,000 to be produced. And they gave them basically zero advance on it. They gave them like... Rachel remembered $1,000. Wendy has recorded as $2,500 as their total advance, because they said, we won't give them an advance because that's money out of our pocket. We'll give them a royalty deal, a big one, because they expected this to have zero sales, so therefore they're getting away without paying the girls anything. Now, producing this album took absolute masses of work. So, even in its improved state, the Moog was essentially a mono-note instrument. It only plays one note at a time. So, for instance, you can't play a chord on it. So every single note has to be recorded on a track, and if you want chords and multiple things, you have to then do another track and another track and another track and another track. Now remember, they've only got the ability to record a maximum of 8 tracks on this 8-track system that she's got, but you can actually only blend in the end 2 tracks on this thing that she helped use, which is, a double track recorder. So they had to use what's called a beat track, which had beats and clicks to let them know when to key in certain things. But every single note on this Moog has to be essentially hand sculpted, as it were, with those slide controls. Its pitch, its tone, everything about it has to be created for that note. Wendy was not very good at writing down the exact settings for every single sodding note in these massive symphonies as she was composing how these things worked. She knew them. She could remember exactly how to do these things and massage it. But this is a very primitive machine. It would go out of tune and out of sync very, very quickly. And she would have to bash it with a hammer to get it to behave and stay in tune. But it also meant painstakingly you could only do a couple of bars, and then you had to stop and then listen to everything to make sure that it hadn't crept ever so slightly out of tune as it went through that detuning process. So agonizing. Remember that these two gals are working 40-hour weeks at Gotham Records at the time. So this was done of an evening, and they were sitting there putting in about 5 hours of work a day on this thing for months and months and months. Hundreds of thousands of hours just going into making this thing. And when it was released, it went platinum. It became one of the most memorable classical albums of all time. It won the Grammy for Best Classical Recording. I think it won multiple Grammys also for the production and engineering of classical albums. Wendy Carlos is the first transgender person to ever win a Grammy. And on a very personal level, apart from the simple success of finally having an album out and have it going that good, it meant massive things for Wendy and her transition. So while studying at Brown University, Wendy encountered the first kind of whispers of transgender studies, which began to let her know what she was feeling. 1966, so this is after meeting Moog and after doing those amazing Philharmonic presentations. Harry Benjamin, of whom I have spoken before in my video on sexology, he produced his groundbreaking book. What was it called again? The Transsexual Phenomenon, where he talked about the therapies that he was developing to deal with gender dysphoria. Wendy contacted him and began going through therapy with him. So Wendy went into full social transition in 1968, living as a woman, and this is all through the production of Switched on Bach. And when that album went platinum and made money, obviously it took a while for money to come in, but that gave her money to pursue medical transitioning. So Wendy Carlos got her gender-affirming surgery in 1972. But here's the thing, this is someone with this massive, massive, massive success. Everyone wants to see them. Everyone wants to do a TV interview. Everyone wants to do a live performance. And Wendy was justifiably terrified because she felt that coming out publicly as a transgender woman, coming out and being seen might expose her as being transgender, and thought that this might destroy her career but also expose her to masses of violence. Wendy actually finally came out publicly at the end of 1979 in a Playboy interview of all things. But this was supposed to be an interview about her music. And she felt completely betrayed by the interview because when it came out, all it did was harp on about her transition. Her sex change, I hate that term. Snoots hates that term as well. So she felt very betrayed by the article because it didn't talk about her music and all the process and the things that she'd actually done other than just change bloody gender presentation. But she was out. But she did say that the fact that it didn't crash her career and the fact that people were so very accepting of it at that time actually dejected her a little because she felt she had lost 10 years pretty much when she could have been more public. How terrified she had been after her first few albums and so on came out. She was asked to do performances with Robert Moog and so on, do these TV interviews. She had to basically drag up as a man, had to put on a male wig, put on glue on false sideburns, take a eyebrow pencil and use makeup to make fake 5 o'clock shadow, and work on deepening her voice so that she sounded more male. And it was torturous. She was recorded as crying in the car the whole way to any of these shows where she had to do this. Poor damn woman. Stevie Wonder turned up to her house to ask to see her amazing Moog setup because he wanted to know more about electronic music. She hid as he knocked on the door and sort of was calling out to her because she just felt she couldn't meet him face to face. It would out her and she was terrified of that. Welcome to our lives. Back to her music, of course. After the success of that first album, she did something else amazing. So her next album was a thing called Sonic Seasonings. This is the first ambient music album ever put out. She was before Tangerine Dream. She was before Brian Eno. The idea was to do an album of electronic music in which moments of quiet and silence are balanced against musical composition to make an ambience. So groundbreaking conceptual musical stuff. Set the stage for all of these other artists to follow. Amazing. Wendy was then asked by movies to start doing some movie scores. She did the score for a movie called Marooned. Now, Marooned, when I was a child, I saw Marooned on TV and it gave me nightmares. I have watched it since. Yeah, it's perfectly watchable. It's just that, to a, 9-year-old child, it was a little bit like, it's about some astronauts being stuck in orbit and can't get down. And again, this spooky electronic ambience is what made it so terrifying. So for her, a bit of a triumph because her inspiration, of course, had come from things like the Forbidden Planet soundtrack and that soundscape. So, kind of a big triumph to be able to sort of celebrate the thing that's inspired you. She was asked in by Kubrick to do the soundtrack to A Clockwork Orange. All hers, for those of you who remembered it. Now, that does include some electronic and some orchestral work as well. Kubrick then wanted her to do The Shining's music, and they're in fact quite disturbed in many ways by this kind of eclectic, terrifying music and soundscape that she'd made, but it was exactly right for the film. Disney contacted her and got her to do the soundtrack for Tron. That's all her work. That, in fact, is the soundtracks that I was listening to that German radio station play. So, a lot of really formative pop culture work there. She continued releasing albums, continued getting awards, continued to help develop the machinery that we use for editing and for working with electronic music. Wendy did an album with Weird Al Yankovic. Weird Al Yankovic's Peter and the Wolf, and Peter and the Wolf 2, and there are flip sides to those. That got, I believe, a Grammy for Best Children's Album. Weird Al. Now, on the obscure insult range, by the way, Warners have never, ever, ever corrected Wendy's name on the Clockwork Orange album credits, and still refuses to this day. Hey, Warners. So, Wendy has remained pretty reclusive in an age when everyone's lives are sort of seen as something that, people put up on social media and so on. Wendy has remained relatively hidden. She has a 16-bit friendly website. Not much has been heard from her since COVID. She was still working through COVID and making some little releases. A lot of her discography has vanished out of main circulation. Hopefully it will be being re-released. Sadly, in her very old age, Wendy has been diagnosed, I believe, with dementia, but is still with us and is apparently still quietly working away. Wendy has lived an amazing life. She has contributed directly to the creation of electronic music as a genre. She has influenced very, very heavily the design of the first electronic instruments and what they then evolved onwards into, and has contributed to the editing processes machinery that make that come to life for us all. She, in many ways, revived a public's interest in classical music by presenting it using electronic instruments, simultaneously showing the world what electronic instruments can do. She created the world's first ambient music albums and has done movie soundtracks and soundscapes for some phenomenal pieces of film, pop culture landmarks like Clockwork Orange, Marooned, The Shining, Tron. She's been a powerhouse. I am very happy for her that her music gave her the ability to afford her medical transition way back then. I'm also sad that her profound experience with being bullied and being subjected to violence made her so painfully conceal her transition. No one should ever have to do that. But she did come through to live very publicly as a proud transgender woman in a creative environment, making memorable pieces of work. So, I salute you. Snoot salutes you. Anyway, her story is ongoing. Thank you, Wendy, for everything you've done. I have enjoyed all of your work. And hopefully we will see this music coming out into the downloadable world in the future as companies re-release these classic albums. Anyway, that's what we've got to say on this subject. We will talk to you anon. Until then, for those of you who are going through hell over in the UK and the USA, hang in there. As I've said, we are winning this fight over here in Oz, and we'll be here to help you take back lost ground. Much love to everybody. Look after yourselves. Mwah. Yep.